Picture this. It's February 1943, somewhere in the sweltering heat of a makeshift airfield in New Guinea. The air is thick, oppressive, the kind that makes your uniform stick to your skin. Inside a corrugated metal hangar that's hotter than hell itself, a 43-year-old captain is doing something that could get him court-martialed. He's standing in front of a B-25 Mitchell bomber. But this isn't just any B-25. This aircraft has been transformed into something the military has never authorized, never approved, never even imagined. Bolted to its nose are 850 caliber machine guns. 8. That's enough firepower to cut a ship in half. The modification is completely illegal. It violates every regulation in the Army Air Corps handbook. Any sane officer would report him immediately. Any by-the-book commander would have him arrested on the spot. But Captain Paul Gunn isn't thinking about regulations. He isn't worried about his career. Because 2 years ago, his wife and 4 children were taken by the enemy, thrown into a prison camp, and he hasn't heard a word about whether they're alive or dead. Every single day for the past 2 years, he's woken up not knowing if his family is still breathing. And that kind of pain, that kind of helplessness, it does something to a man. It transforms him. It makes him dangerous in ways the enemy never anticipated. This illegal bomber, this unauthorized weapon born from one man's rage and desperation, is about to change the course of the Pacific War. It's about to deliver the single most devastating blow to the Japanese Navy in the entire theater. A massacre so complete, so utterly one-sided, that historians would later call it one of the most lopsided victories in naval history. And it all started because one man refused to follow the rules when the rules weren't winning the war. This is the true story of Paul "Pappy" Gunn, the maverick who turned a medium bomber into a ship-killing monster, who channeled his personal agony into tactical genius, and who proved that sometimes the best innovations come not from laboratories or committee meetings, but from a father's desperate need to end a war so he could get his family back. What you're about to hear isn't just a war story. It's a story about what happens when personal tragedy collides with military necessity, when grief becomes innovation, and when one man's unauthorized experiment becomes the weapon that wins battles. Before we dive deep into this incredible journey, I need you to do something for me. Hit that like button right now. I'm serious. Because what's coming next, the twist in this story, the moment when everything changes, you're going to be glad you didn't miss it. And drop a comment telling me, if you were in Pappy Gunn's position, your family trapped behind enemy lines, would you have followed orders, or would you have become a rule breaker too? Now let's go back to where this all began, to the moment when Paul Gunn's world fell apart. December 8th, 1941. The date that changed everything. Not December 7th, like you're thinking. See, the Philippines are across the international date line, which means when Pearl Harbor was burning on December 7th in Hawaii, it was already December 8th in Manila. Paul Gunn was 43 years old, living what most people would consider a pretty good life. He was the operations manager for Philippine Airlines, making solid money, with a beautiful wife named Polly and 4 kids who adored him. He'd been a Navy pilot back in the day, served his time, done his duty, and moved on to civilian life. He was living the dream in Manila, raising his family in paradise, about as far from war as you could get. But that morning, that terrible morning, Paul Gunn stood at Nichols Field in Manila and watched the sky fill with Japanese bombers, wave after wave of them flying in perfect formation, completely unopposed. The American Air Forces in the Philippines, despite having nearly 9 hours of warning after Pearl Harbor, were caught completely unprepared. Gunn watched helplessly as the Japanese systematically destroyed almost every American aircraft on the ground. The explosions were deafening. The smoke turned day into twilight. In less than 2 hours, American air power in the Philippines was essentially wiped out. Within 24 hours, Paul Gunn was in an Army Air Corps uniform with captain's bars on his shoulders. They needed every experienced pilot they could find, and they needed them immediately. Gunn didn't hesitate. He knew what was coming. The Japanese weren't going to stop with the airfields. They were going to take everything, and that meant Manila was about to become a very dangerous place for American civilians. But here's where the story gets truly painful. Here's where you need to understand what made Paul Gunn into the man who would later break every rule in the book. As the Japanese advanced on Manila with terrifying speed, the military evacuation began. Chaos doesn't even begin to describe it. American forces were in full retreat. The plan was to fall back to the Bataan Peninsula, buy time, hold out until reinforcements could arrive. Civilians were supposed to be evacuated, but there weren't enough ships, weren't enough planes, weren't enough hours in the day. Gunn was ordered to fly critical military personnel to Australia, not civilians. Not families, military personnel. The order was crystal clear. He was a military officer now, and he had his orders. But his wife Polly was in Manila with their 4 children. 4 kids. The youngest was just a little girl. They needed to get out. They needed to be on a plane to safety. But there wasn't room. The evacuation priorities were strict. Military personnel first. Essential civilians second. Everyone else would have to wait. Think about that moment. Really think about it. You're a pilot. You have a plane. Your wife and children are in a city that's about to be occupied by an enemy army. You could violate your orders, put your family on that plane, and fly them to safety. A lot of men would have done it. A lot of men did do it. But Paul Gunn didn't. He followed his orders. He left his family behind and flew military personnel to Australia, believing, trusting, desperately hoping that the evacuation would continue, that there would be another plane, another ship, another chance. There wasn't. The Japanese entered Manila on January 2nd, 1942. They moved faster than anyone expected. The city fell before most civilians could evacuate. And on January 20th, 1942, Paul Gunn received the news that would define the rest of his war. His wife Polly and all 4 of their children had been taken to Santo Tomas internment camp. They were prisoners. His family was in enemy hands, and there was absolutely nothing he could do about it. Listen to me carefully, because this is the moment that explains everything that comes after. When Paul Gunn heard that news, something fundamental broke inside him. Not broke like shattered glass, but broke like a dam breaking, releasing something that had been held back. The grief, the guilt, the rage, all of it came flooding out, and it transformed him. The war wasn't about strategy anymore. It wasn't about democracy versus tyranny or America versus Japan. It was personal. Devastatingly, overwhelmingly personal. Gunn made himself a promise in that moment. If he couldn't save his family directly, if he couldn't storm that camp and bring them home, then he would do the next best thing. He would end this war faster than anyone thought possible. He would destroy every Japanese ship, every supply line, every reinforcement convoy he could find. He would make the Japanese pay in blood for every day his family spent behind that wire. This wasn't official military policy. This was vengeance dressed up as tactical innovation, and it was about to change everything. But before we get to how Gunn turned his grief into the most devastating weapon in the Pacific theater, let me ask you something. Are you subscribed to this channel? Because if you're not, you're missing out on stories exactly like this one. Real history that's more intense than any movie. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because I promise you we've got more incredible stories coming that you won't want to miss. Now, let's talk about why the Allies were losing this war so badly that they needed a maverick like Paul Gunn to save them. The air war in the Pacific in 1942 was an absolute disaster. I'm not exaggerating. It was a catastrophe. The Allies had planes, sure. They had the mighty B-17 Flying Fortress, the bomber that was supposed to be the ultimate weapon. But here's the problem. High-altitude precision bombing doesn't work when your target is moving. A B-17 flying at 20,000 feet, trying to hit a ship maneuvering at sea, had about a 1% hit rate. 1%, that means you needed to drop 100 bombs to hit one ship. And bombs were expensive. Fuel was expensive. Aircraft were expensive. Lives were expensive. The Allies were bleeding resources trying to stop Japanese convoys, and the Japanese were getting through almost untouched. Meanwhile, Japan was using those convoys to reinforce their positions all across the Pacific. They were bringing in troops, supplies, ammunition, everything they needed to fortify their conquests and prepare for the long war they knew was coming. Every convoy that got through made the eventual Allied victory more costly, more difficult, more distant, and they were all getting through. The American air forces were essentially ineffective against naval targets. The situation was so desperate that commanders were trying anything. They experimented with different bombing altitudes. They tried different approach angles. They even tried having bombardiers guess where the ship would be by the time the bomb fell. Nothing worked. The Japanese convoys continued to sail with near impunity, and the Allies continued to lose ground in the Southwest Pacific. That's the situation in July 1942, when Major General George C. Kenney took command of Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific. Kenney was 53 years old, a World War I veteran, and known as something of an unconventional thinker. The conventional approach wasn't working, and Kenney knew it. He needed new ideas, new tactics, new weapons. He needed innovation, and he needed it yesterday. Now here's where fate intervenes in this story. Here's where everything starts to come together. Kenney started hearing whispers about a captain who was doing unauthorized modifications to aircraft. This captain was apparently taking A-20 light bombers and crudely mounting extra machine guns on them without any official approval. He was testing them in combat, working out the kinks, improving the design with each mission. It was completely against regulations, the kind of thing that would normally result in disciplinary action. But Kenney wasn't a normal general. He didn't immediately order this rogue captain arrested. Instead, he asked a simple question: do the modifications work? When he was told that yes, they worked remarkably well, Kenney had another question. Who is this captain? The answer was Paul Gunn, the man who had nothing to lose because he'd already lost everything that mattered. The man who was fighting his own private war with an intensity that made other men uncomfortable. Kenney summoned Gunn to his headquarters, and what happened next would change the course of the Pacific War. Most generals would have chewed Gunn out for violating regulations. Kenney did the opposite. He looked at this grief-stricken captain who was channeling his pain into battlefield innovation, and he recognized something valuable, something rare. Kenney saw a man with nothing to lose and everything to gain, a man with the technical knowledge to modify aircraft and the combat experience to know what actually worked in battle. Kenney saw exactly what he needed. Right there, in that meeting, Kenney assigned Gunn to his personal staff and gave him a mission that must have seemed impossible. Take the B-25 Mitchell bomber, a medium bomber designed for level bombing from altitude, and turn it into the ultimate ship killer. Not a minor modification, not a small improvement. A complete transformation. Kenney wanted Gunn to create an aircraft that could fly low, suppress enemy fire, and sink ships with devastating effectiveness. He essentially gave Gunn unlimited authority to experiment, to break rules, to do whatever it took to solve the problem that was losing them the war. For Paul Gunn, this was more than just a military assignment. This was permission to fight his private war with official backing. This was his chance to build a weapon that could actually end this nightmare and bring his family home. He threw himself into the project with an intensity that bordered on obsession. And he wasn't alone. Gunn found a partner in Jack Fox, a factory representative from North American Aviation, the company that manufactured the B-25. Fox was a technical genius who understood the structural capabilities of the aircraft inside and out. Together, Gunn and Fox began to reimagine what a B-25 could be. They weren't thinking about minor improvements. They were thinking about radical transformation. They were thinking about turning a bomber into something that had never existed before. A dedicated ship-killing strafer with the firepower of an entire fighter squadron. Let me paint you a picture of what they did, because this is where Gunn's genius really shines through. The standard B-25 Mitchell was a good aircraft. It was reliable, it could carry a decent bomb load, it had defensive armament, but it was designed to drop bombs from altitude. The nose was made of plexiglass, so the bombardier could see the target. It had standard defensive guns. It was built for a specific role, and that role wasn't working against ships. Gunn looked at that B-25 and saw a blank canvas. First thing he did, working with Fox, was rip out that entire plexiglass nose, just tore it out completely. They replaced it with a solid metal nose plate, and into that plate they mounted 4 50 caliber Browning machine guns. 4 guns pointing straight ahead, all firing together. That was just the beginning. They added 2 more 50 caliber guns in what they called cheek blisters on either side of the forward fuselage. These guns were positioned to give a wider field of fire while still concentrating forward. 6 forward-firing guns now? That's more firepower than most fighter aircraft carried. But Gunn wasn't satisfied. He wanted more. He wanted overwhelming, devastating firepower that would make enemy ships helpless. Here's where Gunn made a decision that was either brilliant or insane, depending on who you ask. The B-25 had a dorsal turret on top of the fuselage with twin 50 caliber guns. Normally, this turret could rotate 360 degrees, allowing the gunner to defend against attacks from any direction. Gunn said forget that. He locked the turret in the forward firing position and rigged it so the pilot could control it. Now the pilot had 8 forward-firing 50 caliber machine guns under his direct control. 8 guns that could all be fired simultaneously. 8 guns that together could unleash 800 rounds per minute, sending 180 pounds of projectiles downrange every single second. Let me put that in perspective for you, because the numbers alone don't capture how utterly devastating this was. A single 50 caliber round is a ½ inch in diameter and weighs about 2 ounces. It's a massive bullet designed to penetrate armor and destroy equipment. When it hits flesh, it doesn't just wound, it destroys. When it hits wood or thin metal, it punches right through. One gun firing 100 rounds per minute is dangerous. 8 guns firing simultaneously is apocalyptic, but the guns were only half of Gunn's innovation. The real genius was in how he planned to use them. Gunn had been experimenting with a technique that was being developed independently by several Allied air forces: skip bombing. The concept was simple in theory, but terrifyingly difficult in practice. Instead of dropping bombs from high altitude and hoping they'd hit a maneuvering target, you'd fly in low and fast, just above the water, and release your bomb so that it would skip across the surface like a stone and slam into the ship's hull at or below the waterline. The advantages were enormous. Ships are armored on top to defend against plunging fire from shells and bombs, but the hulls, especially near the waterline, are much thinner. A bomb exploding against the hull below the waterline doesn't just damage the ship, it floods it. It opens up the internal compartments to the sea. It kills ships fast. But skip bombing required incredible precision, nerves of steel, and a way to survive the approach. That's where Gunn's gun package came in. See, the Japanese weren't stupid. They knew low-level attacks were dangerous. Their ships bristled with anti-aircraft guns designed specifically to shoot down low-flying aircraft. Machine guns, autocannons, even the main guns could be depressed to fire at aircraft coming in at wave-top height. Any previous attempts at low-level attacks had been suicidal. The anti-aircraft fire was just too intense. Planes were getting shot down before they could even release their bombs. But Gunn realized that if you came in with overwhelming firepower of your own, you could suppress the enemy's anti-aircraft guns. You could kill the gunners before they could kill you. That's what the 8 forward-firing 50s were for. The tactic Gunn developed went like this. And I want you to really visualize this, because it's going to be important when we get to the battle. The modified B-25 would approach the target ship at wave-top height, flying so low that the propellers were almost touching the spray at nearly 300 miles per hour. Maximum speed at minimum altitude. At about 1,000 yards out, still closing fast, the pilot would open fire with all 8 machine guns. Picture that. 8 streams of 50 caliber tracers, every 5th round a tracer so you can see where you're shooting, converging on the target ship. The tracers would walk up the side of the ship across the deck, shredding everything in their path. Gun emplacements, exposed crew members, bridge windows, radar equipment, everything. The sheer volume of fire would force the Japanese gunners to take cover. It would create chaos and terror. It would suppress their ability to fight back. At 200 yards, with the enemy deck in chaos and their anti-aircraft fire disrupted, the pilot would release a bomb with a 5-second delay fuse. The bomb would skip across the calm water like a stone across a pond, and it would slam into the ship's hull just at or below the waterline. The B-25 would roar over the top of the ship, and 5 seconds later, deep inside the enemy vessel, the bomb would detonate. The explosion would rip through bulkheads, flood compartments, and tear the structural integrity of the ship apart from the inside. The entire attack, from first shots fired to flying clear, took less than 10 seconds. It was fast, it was violent, and it was absolutely devastating when done correctly. But it was completely untested on a large scale. Gunn had run some trials, sunk a few small coastal vessels, proved the concept worked. But would it work against a major convoy with destroyer escorts and concentrated anti-aircraft fire? Would it work when dozens of guns were shooting back? Would it work when lives and the course of the war depended on it? Nobody knew. It was revolutionary, but it was unproven. And that made a lot of people nervous. The modified B-25s. which the crews started calling strafers or commerce destroyers, began to see limited action in late 1942 and early 1943. The results were promising. Ships that were hit tended to sink fast, but there were problems too. Some pilots came in too low and their bombs skipped over the target. Some came in too high, and the bombs dove under the ship. The timing had to be perfect. The nerve required was enormous. Flying at a ship at 300 miles per hour, 50 feet over the water with every gun on that ship trying to kill you, while calmly aiming and firing your own guns, then releasing your bomb at exactly the right moment. It took a special kind of courage. The kind of courage that comes from either supreme confidence or complete desperation. By late February 1943, Gunn had about a dozen modified B-25s operational, with crews trained in the skip bombing technique, but they were still considered experimental. The top brass was watching, waiting to see if this radical modification would prove its worth or if it was just another failed experiment. They didn't have to wait long. Now I'm going to pause here for just a second, because what's about to happen next is the moment this entire story has been building toward. The moment when Paul Gunn's illegal bomber faces its ultimate test. The moment when innovation meets opportunity and history gets made. But before we get there, I need you to help me out. If you're enjoying this story, if you're as fascinated by this as I am, hit that subscribe button. Seriously, take 2 seconds and subscribe. We work incredibly hard to bring you these deep dives into history that most people never hear about, and your subscription helps us keep making them. Plus, drop a comment and tell me, do you think Gunn's modifications would work today? Or has modern naval defense made this kind of attack obsolete? I'm genuinely curious what you think. Okay, let's get to the battle that proved everything. Late February 1943, Allied intelligence, which was getting better at breaking Japanese codes and tracking their movements, intercepted a message that made everyone sit up and pay attention. The Japanese were assembling a major convoy at Rabaul, their massive base on the island of New Britain. This wasn't just a few supply ships. This was a full-scale reinforcement operation. 8 large transport ships carrying 6,900 troops, along with tons of supplies, ammunition, and equipment. The convoy would be escorted by 8 destroyers, some of the most capable warships in the Japanese Navy. The destination was Lae, on the northern coast of New Guinea. If that convoy got through, it would significantly strengthen Japanese positions in New Guinea, making the eventual Allied advance much more costly. If that convoy got through, it would extend the war, cost more Allied lives, and keep Paul Gunn's family in that prison camp even longer. The convoy had to be stopped. But how? Traditional high-altitude bombing had proven ineffective. The Japanese could see the B-17s coming from miles away and would simply maneuver their ships to avoid the bombs. Previous attempts to attack convoys had resulted in very few hits and relatively minor damage. The Japanese were confident, maybe even arrogant. They expected to lose maybe 1 ship, possibly 2 if the Allies got lucky. They considered it an acceptable loss. They were wrong. They had no idea what was coming. General Kenny saw this convoy as the perfect opportunity to test Gunn's strafers in a major engagement. He assembled a strike force that included conventional bombers, fighters, and the experimental B-25 Strafers. The plan was coordinated and sophisticated. High-altitude B-17s would attack first to disrupt the convoy and force the ships to maneuver. Then Australian Bow fighters, twin-engine heavy fighters, would come in low to suppress anti-aircraft fire with their nose-mounted cannons. And finally, once the defenses were disrupted, Gunn's modified B-25s would deliver the killing blow. The convoy left Rabaul on February 28, 1943. They sailed through the night, following the northern coast of New Britain, heading west toward the Vitiaz Strait. The weather was supposed to be terrible, providing cover from Allied aircraft. But the weather cleared. On the morning of March 2nd, Allied patrol aircraft spotted the convoy. It was exactly where intelligence said it would be. The Japanese had nowhere to hide. The battle officially began on March 2nd with high-altitude attacks that did minor damage, but more importantly, alerted the Japanese that they'd been found. They knew what was coming. They prepared their anti-aircraft defenses, their destroyer escorts moved into protective positions, and they waited for the next attack. It came at dawn on March 3, 1943, and it would be like nothing the Japanese Navy had ever experienced. The Allied strike force that morning included over 90 aircraft. B-17s, Australian Beaufighters, American B-25s, both standard and modified, and fighter escorts. It was the largest concentrated air attack yet conducted in the Pacific Theater. But the star of the show, the weapon that would turn the battle from a fight into a massacre, were gun strafers. Here's how it unfolded, and I want you to really picture this, because eyewitness accounts describe it as one of the most terrifying displays of air power ever witnessed. First, the B-17s came in at high altitude, dropping their bombs and forcing the Japanese ships to maneuver violently. The convoy broke formation. The destroyers laid down smoke screens trying to hide the transports. It was chaos, but the Japanese had dealt with this before. They knew how to handle high-altitude attacks. What they didn't know how to handle was what came next. The Beaufighters came in low, just above the wave tops, and opened up with their 4 20mm cannons. The explosive shells raked the decks of the Japanese ships, destroying gun positions and forcing the crews to take cover. The anti-aircraft fire, which should have been a wall of steel protecting the convoy, was disrupted and disorganized. The Japanese gunners were taking cover instead of shooting back. And that's when the strafers arrived. Imagine you're a Japanese sailor on one of those transport ships. You've survived the high-altitude bombing. You've survived the cannon fire from the Beaufighters. You're at your battle station, trying to get your anti-aircraft gun back into action, trying to do your job, trying to defend your ship. And then you see them coming. Not high in the sky where you can track them and estimate their approach. No. They're right there on the horizon, barely above the water, coming directly at you at 300 miles per hour. And they're big. These aren't fighters. These are medium bombers, and they're flying like fighters, and they're coming straight at your ship. At 1,000 yards, you see the flashes from their noses. 8 machine guns per aircraft. Multiple aircraft in the attack, all firing at once. The tracers look like solid beams of light converging on your ship. You hear the sounds, a continuous roar like a giant piece of canvas being ripped in half as hundreds of .50 caliber rounds slam into your vessel. The rounds are punching through metal, shattering glass, tearing through wood, and cutting through flesh like it's not even there. Your shipmates are dying around you. Equipment is being destroyed. Your own gun position is being shredded before you can even aim your weapon, and then the bomb drops. You see it leave the aircraft, hit the water, skip once, twice, and slam into your ship's hull right at the waterline. The aircraft roars over your head so close you can see the rivets on its belly, and then it's gone. 5 seconds later, deep in your ship's guts, the bomb explodes. The deck heaves under your feet. You hear the screaming of tortured metal. You feel the ship lurch. And then another strafer makes its run. And another, and another. That's what the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was like for the Japanese. It was systematic destruction. It was technological superiority meeting tactical innovation, and the result was carnage on a scale that shocked even the Allied pilots conducting the attack. The first transport ship, the Kyokusei Maru, was hit multiple times in rapid succession. Bombs skipped into her hull below the waterline in 3 separate places. She started listing immediately, water pouring into her compartments faster than the pumps could handle. Within 15 minutes of the first Straffer attack, she rolled over and sank, taking hundreds of troops with her. The Teiyo Maru went next. She was one of the largest transports in the convoy, carrying nearly 1,000 troops. The strafers concentrated on her, multiple aircraft making attack runs. The deck was shredded by machine gun fire. Every exposed position was swept clean. The bombs opened her hull like a can opener. She burned and sank, and when she went down, she took most of her human cargo with her. The men in the water, clinging to debris, became targets themselves as Allied aircraft made strafing runs on the survivors. It sounds brutal, and it was. But the Allied pilots knew these men would be reinforcements for Japanese positions where their own comrades would have to fight them. This was total war, and mercy was in short supply. The destroyer Shirayuki, Admiral Kimura's flagship, tried to protect the transports. She put herself between the convoy and the attackers, her anti-aircraft guns blazing. But the strafers were too fast, too low, and there were too many of them. A B-25 came in head-on, guns firing. The bridge of the Shirayuki disintegrated. The admiral and his command staff were killed instantly. Moments later, a skip bomb hit the destroyer amidships. The explosion broke her keel. She sank in less than 10 minutes, one of the fastest sinking destroyers in naval history. One by one, the Japanese ships were systematically destroyed. The Ayo Maru, the Shinai Maru, the Nojima, every transport in the convoy was hit, was burning, was sinking. The destroyers tried to fight back, tried to protect their charges, but they were outnumbered and outfought. The Tokitsukaze was hit and disabled. The Yukikaze and Asaguma were damaged. The Arashio was sunk. The ocean was littered with burning, sinking vessels and thousands of men in the water. The attack lasted about 40 minutes. When it was over, when the Allied aircraft had expended their ammunition and bombs and turned for home, the results were almost unbelievable. All 8 transport ships were sunk or sinking. 4 destroyers were sunk. The remaining destroyers were damaged and fleeing. Of the 6,900 troops that had left Rabaul, fewer than 3,000 would make it to shore, and most of those would be without weapons or equipment. The convoy had been completely annihilated. It was one of the most one-sided victories in naval history. Allied losses were minimal. 4 aircraft shot down, 13 airmen killed or missing. That's it! In exchange for 4 aircraft and 13 men, the Allies had sunk 12 ships and killed or drowned over 3,000 enemy soldiers and sailors. The kill ratio was almost inconceivable. And the strafers, guns' illegal bombers, had been responsible for most of the destruction. The skip bombing technique had proven devastatingly effective. The concentrated forward firepower had suppressed enemy defenses exactly as designed. Everything Gunn had envisioned, everything he had fought for, everything he had built in that hot hangar in New Guinea, had worked beyond anyone's wildest expectations. When the strike force returned to base, the pilots were in a state of shock. They'd never seen anything like it. They'd never imagined air power could be that decisive against naval targets. One pilot described it as like shooting fish in a barrel, except the fish were trying to shoot back. Another said, it wasn't a battle. It was an execution. The strafers had performed so well that General Kenny immediately ordered more B-25s modified to gun specifications. The concept had proven itself. What started as one man's unauthorized experiment was now official doctrine. But the impact of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea went far beyond just one destroyed convoy. The Japanese Navy was forced to completely rethink its resupply strategy in the Southwest Pacific. They couldn't risk sending convoys in daylight anymore. They had to resort to nighttime runs using fast destroyers, which could carry far fewer troops and supplies. This severely hampered their ability to reinforce their positions in New Guinea. The Japanese advance, which had seemed unstoppable just months earlier, ground to a halt. They couldn't reinforce their positions, couldn't replace their losses, couldn't maintain the logistics needed for offensive operations. From the Japanese perspective, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was a catastrophe. They'd lost not just ships and men, but the initiative. The psychological impact was enormous. Japanese commanders became afraid to move their convoys within range of Allied air bases. Their soldiers in New Guinea, isolated and unsupplied, began to slowly starve. The tide of the war in the Pacific was turning, and a big part of that turn was because of Paul Gunn's strafers. The success of the B-25 strafer was so complete, so undeniable, that North American Aviation, the company that manufactured the B-25, incorporated Gunn's modifications into their production line. They created the B-25G variant, which featured a 75mm cannon in the nose along with machine guns. Then came the B-25H with even more forward-firing armament. And finally, the B-25J, the most produced variant, which could be configured as either a strafer or a conventional bomber. Paul Gunn's battlefield modification, his illegal experiment, became standard issue. These aircraft would go on to devastate Japanese logistics throughout the rest of the war. They sank hundreds of ships, destroyed thousands of tons of supplies, and killed tens of thousands of enemy troops. All because one grieving father refused to accept that the war was being fought the wrong way. But what about Gunn himself? What happened to the man at the center of this story? He didn't rest on his laurels. He didn't sit back and collect medals. He kept fighting. He kept flying combat missions, kept modifying aircraft, kept pushing for new innovations. He was wounded in action, took shrapnel in his leg that ended his days as a combat pilot. But even then, he stayed in the theater, kept working on aircraft modifications, kept training new pilots in the tactics he'd developed. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel, received the Distinguished Service Cross, and became something of a legend among the airmen in the Pacific, but none of that mattered to him as much as what happened on February 3rd, 1945. That's the day American forces liberated the Santo Tomas internment camp in Manila. Among the 4,000 starving, sick, traumatized internees were Polly Gunn and her 4 children. They had survived 3 years and 2 weeks as prisoners, living in appalling conditions, never knowing if they'd see their husband and father again. But they had survived. The Japanese had kept them barely alive, probably without even knowing that the man whose family they'd imprisoned had done more to destroy their war effort than almost any other individual in the Pacific theater. A few weeks after the liberation, Paul Gunn was reunited with his family in Australia. I can't even imagine what that reunion was like. 3 years of not knowing, 3 years of guilt and rage and desperate hope, and then finally holding his wife and children again. Eyewitnesses said Gunn, this tough, hardened combat veteran who'd seen more action than most men could survive, broke down and wept like a child. His private war was over. His family was safe. The revenge he'd been exacting, bomb by bomb, ship by ship, had finally brought them home. Think about the full arc of this story. A civilian airline manager is thrust into war. He loses his family to the enemy. He's consumed by guilt for following orders instead of saving them. He channels that guilt and rage into innovation. He breaks the rules, violates regulations, and creates a weapon that changes the course of the war. That weapon helps shorten the war, and shortening the war saves his family's lives. It's almost too perfect to be true, but it is true. Every word of it. Paul Gunn's story is a testament to what happens when personal tragedy collides with military necessity. It's about what one determined man can accomplish when he refuses to accept the status quo. But it's also a story that raises some uncomfortable questions, questions that we need to think about even today. Was Paul Gunn a hero, or was he a man consumed by vengeance who just happened to be on the right side? Does it matter? His modifications saved countless Allied lives. Every convoy he helped destroy was a convoy that couldn't reinforce Japanese positions, couldn't resupply enemy troops, couldn't extend the war. How many American, Australian, and Allied soldiers came home because Japanese reinforcements never arrived? How many battles were won more easily because the enemy was starving and undersupplied? The numbers are impossible to calculate, but they're significant. Gunn's innovation had ripple effects across the entire Pacific theater, but let's also be honest about what the strafers did. They were instruments of mass killing. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea wasn't just a military victory, it was a massacre. Thousands of Japanese soldiers drowned in the ocean, and Allied aircraft strafed many of the survivors in the water. That's a war crime by modern standards, though it wasn't considered one at the time. The strafers that Gunn developed went on to destroy hundreds of ships, and with those ships died thousands upon thousands of enemy sailors and soldiers. These were men with families, too, men who were following their own orders, men who probably didn't want to be at war any more than Gunn wanted to be. War is complicated. War is ugly. And the innovations that win wars are often innovations in how to kill more efficiently. Gunn's Strafer was essentially a flying machine gun platform designed to kill people and sink ships. It was remarkably good at both. The moral calculus of whether that makes Gunn a hero or just an efficient killer is something each of us has to work out for ourselves. But history remembers him as a hero, and there's a good reason for that. See, what separates Gunn from just being another weapon designer was his motivation. He wasn't trying to advance his career. He wasn't trying to make money. He wasn't even primarily trying to win the war, at least not at first. He was trying to save his family. Everything else, all the destroyed ships, all the tactical innovations, all the changes to Allied air doctrine, all of that grew out of one man's desperate need to end a war so he could get his wife and children back. There's something deeply human about that, something that transcends the violence and the death and the strategic considerations. And here's the thing that really gets me about this story. Gunn succeeded. Against all odds, despite starting as a civilian airline manager with no combat experience, despite being 43 years old when most combat pilots were in their 20s, despite violating regulations and taking risks that should have gotten him court-martialed, despite creating a weapon that was completely unproven and could have been a catastrophic failure, He succeeded. His family survived. The war ended. Justice, if you can call anything in war just, was served. After the war, Paul Gunn stayed in the Philippines. He went back to civilian aviation, helped rebuild Philippine Airlines, and raised his family in the country he'd fought so hard to liberate. He never sought publicity. He never wrote a memoir. He never tried to capitalize on his wartime innovations. He just wanted to live quietly with his family, which is all he'd wanted in the first place. He died in 1957 at the age of 59, probably from complications related to his wartime injuries. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people, including many of the pilots who'd flown the strafers he'd modified. They came to pay their respects to a man who'd saved their lives by giving them a weapon that actually worked. But here's what's really remarkable about Paul Gunn's legacy: the principles he established. The ideas he proved, they're still relevant today. The concept of suppressing enemy defenses with overwhelming firepower before delivering your main attack, that's still doctrine. The idea of modifying existing platforms to fill urgent tactical needs rather than waiting years for new purpose-built equipment, that still happens. The AC-130 gunship, one of the most feared weapons in the modern military arsenal, is a direct descendant of Gunn's philosophy. Take an aircraft, load it up with guns, and use it to deliver concentrated firepower on ground or naval targets. The A-10 Warthog, built around a massive 30mm cannon designed to destroy tanks, that's Gunn's thinking. Build the aircraft around the weapon, not the other way around. The modern concept of close air support, where aircraft work in direct coordination with ground forces to suppress and destroy enemy positions, that owes a debt to the tactics Gunn pioneered. Even the psychological warfare aspect, using overwhelming firepower to break enemy morale, that was something Gunn understood instinctively. The Japanese sailors who survived the Battle of the Bismarck Sea never forgot the terror of those strafers coming in at wave-top height. That fear spread through the Japanese Navy and changed their behavior for the rest of the war. Now, I want to take a moment here because we are near the end of this incredible story, and I need to ask you something important. Have you hit that subscribe button yet? Have you turned on notifications? Because if you've made it this far, if you've stuck with me through this entire journey, then you're exactly the kind of person this channel is for. We dig deep into history to find these incredible stories that most people never hear. Stories of innovation, courage, tragedy, and triumph. Stories that are more compelling than any fiction. And we need your support to keep making them. So do me a favor, subscribe right now. Turn on that notification bell. And share this video with someone who loves history, someone who appreciates a good story, someone who needs to know about Paul Gunn and his illegal bomber. Your support literally makes these videos possible. Okay, let's bring this home. Let's talk about what we can learn from Paul Gunn's story, because I think there are lessons here that go way beyond military history. First, and maybe most important, bureaucracy and regulations exist for good reasons, but they're not sacred. When the rules aren't working, when the approved methods are failing, sometimes you need someone willing to break the rules and try something new. Gunn could have followed procedure, submitted his ideas through proper channels, waited for committee approval, and by the time his modifications were officially sanctioned, the war might have been lost. Instead, he just did it. He built what needed to be built and proved it worked through results. Now, I'm not saying you should go around violating every rule that inconveniences you. Most rules exist for good reasons and should be followed. But there are moments, rare moments, when innovation requires stepping outside the established framework. When it does, you better be prepared to prove your concept works, because if it fails, those rules you violated will crush you. Gunn took that risk because he had nothing to lose and everything to gain. His gamble paid off, but it could have easily gone the other way. Second lesson: grief and pain, channeled properly, can be incredibly productive. Gunn could have let his guilt and rage consume him. He could have become bitter, self-destructive, paralyzed by depression. A lot of men in his situation would have. Instead, he channeled all that emotional energy into solving a problem. His pain became fuel for innovation. His rage became focus. His guilt became motivation. I'm not saying that's healthy necessarily. I'm not saying it's the right way to process trauma. But I am saying it worked. Gunn turned his worst moment into something meaningful, something that saved lives and changed history. Third lesson. Technical knowledge combined with combat experience is a powerful combination. Gunn wasn't just a pilot. He'd worked in aircraft maintenance and management. He understood how planes were built, how they could be modified, what their limitations were. And he'd also seen combat, understood what actually worked in battle versus what looked good on paper. That combination of theoretical knowledge and practical experience is what enabled him to create something truly innovative. If he'd been just an engineer with no combat time, he might have designed something that looked perfect in a lab, but failed in actual combat. If he'd been just a pilot with no technical knowledge, he wouldn't have known how to actually implement his ideas. He was both, and that made all the difference. Fourth lesson. Timing matters. Gunn's modifications came at exactly the right moment. The Allies were desperate for a solution to the convoy problem. Traditional methods weren't working. People were ready to try something new. If Gunn had proposed his strafer concept in peacetime, it would have been rejected as too radical, too expensive, too risky. But in the context of 1942, when the war was going badly and commanders were willing to try anything, his idea found receptive ears. Innovation often requires not just a good idea, but the right context for that idea to flourish. Gunn had both. Fifth lesson, and this one's important. The best weapons are the ones that change enemy behavior. The strafer didn't just sink ships. It made the Japanese afraid to send ships. After the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, Japanese commanders completely changed their convoy tactics. They stopped sailing in daylight. They used faster ships that could carry less cargo. They avoided areas within range of Allied airfields. In other words, the mere existence of the strafer constrained Japanese options and forced them to fight the war on Allied terms. That's strategic success that goes beyond just tactical victories. But perhaps the most important lesson from Paul Gunn's story is this. Never underestimate what one person can accomplish when they refuse to give up. Think about it. A 43-year-old civilian airline manager thrust into a war he didn't ask for, family taken prisoner, following orders that he would regret for the rest of his life. He could have done his job quietly, flown his missions, waited for the war to end, and hoped his family would survive. Instead, he decided to personally change the course of the war. And he did it. One man, one idea, one unauthorized modification that became doctrine and changed the entire Pacific campaign. That's not just a military story. That's a human story. It's a story about refusing to accept that things have to be the way they are. It's about looking at a problem everyone says is unsolvable and saying, I'm going to solve it anyway. It's about turning tragedy into purpose, pain into productivity, and desperation into innovation. It's about a father's love for his family being so strong that it literally changed history. Now, I want to address something that some of you might be thinking. Was all of this really because of Paul Gunn? Wasn't skip bombing being developed independently by other forces? Didn't other people contribute to the strafer concept? And the answer is yes, absolutely. Gunn wasn't working in a vacuum. Jack Fox, his collaborator from North American Aviation, was crucial to the technical implementation. General Kenny provided the command support and authority needed. Other pilots and engineers contributed ideas. The Australians were experimenting with similar low-level tactics. This wasn't a one-man show, but Gunn was the catalyst. He was the one who pushed hardest, risked most, and delivered results when they were needed most. He was the one who had the personal motivation to see it through no matter what. Innovation rarely comes from a single person, but it often requires a single person who refuses to quit, who pushes everyone else forward, who makes things happen through sheer force of will. That was Paul Gunn. Without him, the strafer concept might have eventually been developed, but it wouldn't have happened when it did, and timing, as we discussed, was everything. Let's also talk about the cost, because every story of innovation in warfare has a cost, and we shouldn't ignore it. The strafers killed thousands of people. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was a slaughter. Many of the Japanese sailors and soldiers who died in that battle were conscripts, young men who didn't want to be at war any more than their Allied counterparts did. They had families too. They had children who would grow up without fathers. The efficiency of Gunn's weapon meant more death, more suffering, more grief, even if it was enemy grief. And some of the pilots who flew the strafers died too. Flying at 50 feet above the water at 300 miles per hour, approaching a ship that's shooting at you with everything it has, is incredibly dangerous. Equipment failures, pilot error, lucky enemy shots, all of these killed Allied airmen. The strafer tactics had a lower casualty rate than traditional bombing, yes, but men still died. Some of them died testing guns modifications. Some died because the tactics weren't perfected yet. Innovation in warfare always has a blood cost, and we honor those who paid it by remembering their sacrifice. But we also have to weigh that cost against what would have happened without the strafers. How much longer would the war have lasted if Japanese convoys continued to get through? How many more Allied soldiers would have died fighting reinforced enemy positions? How many more civilians would have suffered under Japanese occupation? How many more prisoners would have died in camps like the one where Gunn's family was held? The brutal calculus of war suggests that Gunn's innovation, for all its deadly efficiency, probably saved more lives than it cost by shortening the war and preventing Japanese reinforcement. That doesn't make the deaths less tragic, but it provides context for why Gunn's work mattered. Here's something else worth considering. Paul Gunn's story almost didn't survive. He died in relative obscurity in 1957. Most history books don't mention him. The official histories of the Pacific War focus on the big names, the generals and admirals, the major battles and strategic decisions. Gunn was just a lieutenant colonel who modified some aircraft and flew some missions. Nothing special, right? Wrong. His story survived because the pilots who flew his strafers never forgot him. They passed the story down, told their children and grandchildren about the maverick who gave them a weapon that actually worked, who saved their lives by making the enemy's ships vulnerable. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea gets coverage in history books, but often the strafers are just mentioned in passing as one element of the attack, without explaining where they came from or who developed them. It wasn't until historians started digging deeper, interviewing veterans, going through personal papers and unit records, that the full story of Paul Gunn emerged. And it's a better story than most of what makes it into the official histories, because it's personal, it's human. It's about individuals making choices under impossible circumstances. And that brings me to why I wanted to tell you this story today. History isn't just about presidents and generals. It's not just about the big decisions made in Washington or Tokyo. It's also about individuals, people like us, facing extraordinary circumstances and making choices that ripple outward in ways they never imagined. Paul Gunn didn't set out to change the course of the Pacific War. He set out to save his family. But in pursuing that personal goal, he created something that had strategic consequences. That's how history actually works most of the time. Individual actions, personal motivations, cascading into larger effects. Every person watching this video right now is facing their own challenges, their own problems that seem unsolvable, their own bureaucracies that seem immovable. Maybe you're in a job that's not working. Maybe you're facing a system that seems designed to prevent change. Maybe you feel powerless to affect the things that matter most to you. Paul Gunn's story says that you're not powerless. It says that one person with motivation, knowledge, and determination can change things that everyone else says can't be changed. It says that sometimes you have to break the rules, take the risk, and prove your concept through results rather than waiting for permission. Now, I'm going to be straight with you about something. There's a reason stories like Paul Gunn's are important beyond just entertainment value. We live in a time when it's easy to feel like individuals don't matter, like the systems are too big, the problems are too complex, the forces arrayed against change are too powerful. Paul Gunn's story is a reminder that individuals always matter. One person with the right idea at the right time can change everything. That's not just inspirational rhetoric. That's historical fact, proven over and over again throughout history. But here's the uncomfortable part that we also have to acknowledge. For every Paul Gunn whose unauthorized experiment changed the war for the better, there were probably a dozen officers who broke the rules and their experiments failed, got people killed, and were court-martialed and forgotten. We remember Gunn because he succeeded. We don't remember the failures. There's a survivorship bias in how we tell these stories. We celebrate the mavericks who were proven right, but we don't talk much about the mavericks who were proven wrong. So I'm not standing here telling you to go violate every rule and assume you'll be vindicated by results. What I am saying is that Gunn made a calculated risk based on knowledge, experience, and desperate motivation. He didn't just randomly break rules. He had a clear vision of what needed to change and why, the technical knowledge to implement that change, and the courage to face the consequences if he was wrong. That combination is rare, but when it comes together, it can move mountains. Let me bring this back to where we started, to that hot hangar in New Guinea, to Paul Gunn standing in front of his modified B-25 with 8 machine guns bolted to its nose. That moment represents a choice that all of us face at some point. Follow the rules that aren't working, or break them and risk everything on a better idea. Most of the time, following the rules is the right choice. Most of the time, your better idea probably isn't as good as you think it is. But sometimes, rare times, the rules are wrong and your idea is right, and in those moments you have to have the courage to act. Paul Gunn had that courage. He channeled his grief into innovation. He turned his pain into purpose. He refused to accept that his family was just going to have to wait out the war while he followed procedures that weren't winning. And because of that refusal, because of that courage, because of that one unauthorized modification in a hot hangar in the South Pacific, thousands of Allied soldiers came home who might not have otherwise. The war ended sooner. Lives were saved. And 4 children got their father back. That's the power of one person refusing to quit. That's the power of innovation born from desperation. That's the power of love transformed into action. Paul "Pappy" Gunn wasn't a traditional hero. He was a maverick, a rule breaker, a man fighting his own private war within the larger war. But he was exactly what the Allies needed at exactly the right moment. And his legacy lives on in every gunship, every close air support mission. Every time a tactical modification proves that field innovation can be as important as laboratory research. So here's my final question for you, and I really want you to think about this. What's your B-25 strafer? What's the problem in your life or your work or your community that everyone says can't be solved, at least not the way you want to solve it? What's the rule that's preventing progress, the procedure that's failing, the system that's broken? And what are you willing to risk to fix it? Because Paul Gunn's story tells us that sometimes the answer isn't to wait for someone else to solve the problem. Sometimes the answer is to build the solution yourself, prove it works, and let the results speak for themselves. Now, before we close out, I need you to do 3 things for me. First, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. We've got more incredible stories like this one coming, and you don't want to miss them. Second, drop a comment and tell me, what's your biggest takeaway from Paul Gunn's story? What part of this resonated with you the most? I read every comment and I'm genuinely interested in your thoughts. And third, share this video. Share it with someone who needs to hear about Paul Gunn. Share it with someone who's facing an impossible problem. Share it with someone who loves history or aviation or stories of courage under fire. These stories matter, and they only reach people if you help spread them. Paul Gunn died in 1957, but his story lives on. Every time someone challenges the status quo with a better idea, that's Paul Gunn's legacy. Every time someone refuses to accept that problems are unsolvable, that's his spirit continuing. Every time innovation comes from unexpected places, from people who aren't supposed to have the answers, that's the lesson he taught being applied again. And every time a father or mother fights to protect their family against impossible odds, that's the love that drove him being expressed in a new generation. The illegal bomber that Paul Gunn built in that hot hangar in 1943 doesn't exist anymore. The strafers were retired after the war, replaced by newer aircraft with more advanced technology. But the principles behind that modification, the courage that created it, and the love that motivated it, those are eternal. Those are what make this story worth telling 80 years later. Those are what make Paul Gunn a hero, not just of World War II, but of human ingenuity and determination. Thank you for sticking with me through this entire journey. Thank you for caring about history, about innovation, about the individual stories that make up the larger narrative. If you learned something today, if this story moved you, if it made you think differently about what one person can accomplish, then we've done our job. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next video where we'll dive into another incredible story that history almost forgot. Until then, remember, Sometimes the best way to honor the rules is to know when to break them in service of something greater. That's what Paul Gunn taught us. That's his legacy, and that's a lesson worth remembering.
You know that moment right before something catastrophic happens? That split second where everything goes wrong? Imagine being a Luftwaffe pilot in 1944, one of the most decorated aces in the entire Nazi regime, with a kill count in the double digits. You've survived hundreds of sorties over hostile territory. You've outmaneuvered experienced pilots. You've felt the G-forces rip at your body as you pulled your fighter into the tightest turns imaginable. You know every weakness, every limitation of every aircraft the Allies have thrown at you. You've studied their tactics, learned their patterns, and mastered the art of exploiting their mistakes. But then, one day, everything you thought you knew became completely, utterly obsolete. Picture this. You're at 20,000 feet, the sun climbing higher behind you, silhouetting you against the brilliant blue sky. Your Messerschmitt Bf 109 is cruising at its maximum speed of about 400 miles per hour, and you spot them coming from the west. American fighters, P-51 Mustangs to be specific. You've tangled with these birds before, and while they're formidable, you know their limits. They're fast for a bomber escort, sure, but they're not unbeatable. Nothing is. You've learned to fight them by exploiting their weak spots in a climb, by using your superior maneuverability in a turn, by baiting them into tight banking maneuvers that bleed their speed away. You've survived this long by being smarter, faster, and more ruthless than your opponents. So, you make your move. You bank hard to the left, dropping your nose slightly to gain speed, accelerating toward the enemy formation with the confidence of someone who's done this dance 100 times before. You've got the Mustang dead in your gun sight. You're closing the distance, getting ready for the money shot. That perfect moment where you can rake the enemy fuselage with machine gun fire and send another American pilot tumbling out of the sky in a ball of flame. Your finger tightens on the trigger. The moment is here. Victory is within arm's reach. And then something absolutely, utterly inexplicable happens. The Mustang doesn't do what it's supposed to do. Instead of trying to run, instead of attempting a defensive maneuver, instead of doing literally anything predictable, it just vanishes. The acceleration is so violent, so completely off the charts that for a split second you think maybe you're hallucinating. Maybe the altitude is getting to you. Maybe you've been breathing oxygen too long. But no, you're watching it happen in real time. The American fighter is accelerating away from you like you're literally standing still, climbing at a rate that seems to defy the laws of physics themselves. It's ascending vertically, its engine screaming with a power output you didn't think was possible, and within seconds it's a speck on the horizon, then completely out of sight. You're left staring at empty sky, your heart pounding, your hands shaking on the stick, completely and utterly baffled. What in the hell just happened? That wasn't some new aircraft design. It wasn't some brilliant new evasion tactic. It wasn't even pilot skill. Because no human being, no matter how talented, can make a Bf 109 do what you just witnessed. Something else is going on. Something that makes your skin crawl with the realization that the game has changed fundamentally. The Luftwaffe pilots started whispering about it in the officers' clubs, trading stories that sounded like pure science fiction. Mustangs that could do impossible climbs. Mustangs that could catch Messerschmitts in a dive. Mustangs that seemed to have performance characteristics that shouldn't be possible given their known engine specifications and airframe design. The German High Command dismissed these reports as combat fatigue, as exaggeration from frightened pilots, as the kind of tall tales that naturally spring up during wartime. But the pilots weren't imagining things. They weren't cracking under stress. They were witnessing something real, something revolutionary, something that would fundamentally change the course of the aerial war over Europe. And the secret wasn't hiding in the aircraft's design. It wasn't locked away in some classified engineer's notebook. The secret was flowing right through the Mustang's fuel lines, pulsing through its engines, quite literally burning away the Luftwaffe's dominance of the skies. Before I get into the incredible true story of how American chemists created the most powerful aviation fuel ever, developed and used it to systematically destroy the German Air Force, I gotta ask you something real quick. If you're passionate about military history, if you love learning about the untold stories that shaped our world, if you get genuinely pumped up about legendary aircraft and the people who flew them, then do me an absolutely massive favor and smash that subscribe button right now. We're talking about some of the most fascinating, most gripping content on the entire platform, and you're gonna want to see every single video we put out. Every week we dive deep into the forgotten stories, the hidden heroes, the classified weapons systems that changed everything. Subscribe right now, and you'll never miss another minute of this incredible stuff. And while you're at it, turn on those notifications so YouTube actually alerts you when we go live with new content. Let's go. Now, back to the story. This is one of the most intense, most dramatic sagas in military aviation history. This is the true story of Grade 150 aviation fuel, the mysterious Purple Death that transformed America's already impressive P-51 Mustang fighter into an absolutely untouchable unstoppable 490-mile-per-hour sky demon that could literally run circles around every German fighter in the entire Luftwaffe. By the time you finish watching this video, you're gonna understand exactly how a few chemical tweaks in an American refinery systematically dismantled, destroyed, and obliterated the entire German Air Force's ability to defend their own airspace. You're gonna learn about the scientists who made it possible, the pilots who weaponized it, and the terrified German aces who faced it and lived to tell stories nobody would believe. Stick around because this is about to get absolutely wild. Let's back up for just a second and set the stage. The year is early 1944, and if you're a German pilot, life has been getting progressively worse for a solid year now. The skies over German-controlled territory have basically transformed into a living nightmare, an absolute slaughterhouse where American bombers are coming over in formations so massive they literally black out the sun. We're talking about hundreds of B-17s, B-24s, and other heavy bombers flying in tight defensive formations, absolutely hammering German industrial targets day after day after day. The American 8th Air Force is essentially conducting round-the-clock bombing campaigns that are crippling German aircraft production, destroying oil refineries, flattening rail yards, and systematically grinding down the Nazi war machine. But here's the thing that makes it even worse for German defenders. The Luftwaffe is getting absolutely shredded trying to protect their own territory. Every day, German fighter pilots are getting scrambled, going up against these massive bomber formations and getting slaughtered. They're dealing with B-17s that are bristling with machine guns, protected by incredibly well-coordinated fighter escort formations, and they're taking catastrophic losses in exchange for relatively few bomber kills. The Germans had this one advantage, though. Long-range bomber escorts just weren't a reality in the American arsenal. The American bombers were flying these deep penetration missions into German territory with limited fighter cover. And once they got past the point where the American fighters had to turn back to avoid running out of fuel, the German fighters had an opportunity to absolutely tear the bomber formations to shreds. Everything changed when the brand-new P-51 Mustang showed up with its incredible game-changing range. Suddenly, American fighters could stay with the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. They could pick off German fighters with impunity. They could fundamentally alter the balance of power in the air war. But as good as the Mustang already was, the Americans wanted more. They wanted an edge so significant that German pilots wouldn't even bother engaging. They wanted a performance advantage so overwhelming that the mere sight of a Mustang would be enough to make German pilots turn tail and run. And that's where the fuel came in. Here's something most people don't understand about how fighter aircraft actually work. The horsepower, the speed, the climb rate, Yeah, all of that stuff depends on the engine design, the airframe, the aerodynamics. But there's another factor that's equally, sometimes even more important than those things, and that's the fuel. Think of it like this. Octane rating is essentially a measure of how much you can squeeze the air-fuel mixture in an engine before it spontaneously explodes all by itself. This catastrophic event is called detonation, or in pilot speak, it's called getting knocked. It's a spontaneous explosion that occurs before the spark plug even fires, and it's absolutely devastating to an engine. It can destroy pistons, crack cylinder heads, and turn an engine into a smoking, useless hunk of metal in seconds. Low-octane fuel is basically like a boxer who has a glass jaw. It can take a tiny bit of pressure, a tiny bit of compression before it just completely fails. You punch it even once, and it's knocked out. Lights out. Game over. The engine literally destroys itself under high compression. That's why lower-octane fuel limits engine performance. You can't squeeze the piston down very hard at all before you risk catastrophic detonation. You have to run the engine at lower pressures, which means less power, less speed, less performance across the board. It's like you're driving with the parking brake on the entire time. High-octane fuel is completely different. High-octane fuel can take an absolutely massive punch. You can squeeze the air-fuel mixture down to insane pressures, pump huge amounts of boost into the cylinders, and the fuel will just sit there and wait for the spark plug to ignite it at exactly the right moment. High-octane fuel lets engines run at pressures that would cause immediate detonation in low-octane fuel, which means significantly more power output, significantly better performance, and significantly better combat effectiveness. Every extra mile per hour of speed is another chance for a pilot to catch an enemy fighter, to escape from a dangerous situation, or to deliver a devastating attack and get out of there before enemy fire can find the range. The British had already shocked the hell out of the Germans once before, way back during the Battle of Britain when they started using 100-octane fuel in their Spitfires. That single-digit advantage in octane rating gave British fighters a critical performance boost at precisely the moment when it mattered most. The Spitfires could turn just a little bit tighter, climb just a little bit faster, and that small advantage multiplied across hundreds of fighters and hundreds of engagements, was absolutely crucial in turning the tide of that battle. German pilots had to completely rethink their tactics because the Spitfires suddenly had a performance edge that made the Bf 109's traditional advantages mostly irrelevant. But what was happening in American and British laboratories in 1943 and 1944 was going to make that 100-octane advantage look like child's play. American and British chemists were working on a breakthrough that Germany's entire synthetic fuel program couldn't come close to matching. They weren't just talking about bumping up the octane rating by a few points. They were developing something so fundamentally revolutionary, so incredibly powerful, that it literally broke the existing octane scale. The octane rating system only went up to 100, which represented the performance of pure, perfect isooctane. Anything better than that didn't fit on the existing scale. So the scientists had to literally invent a brand new measurement system to account for this new fuel's performance characteristics. They called this new measurement system the performance number, or PN for short. The fuel they created was designated grade 150, and this meant it could handle 50% more pressure than pure, perfect isooctane. We're talking about a chemical masterpiece, a fuel that was so special, so uniquely powerful, that ground crews were able to identify it instantly by a single visual indicator. They dyed it a distinct shade of purple, almost like a fluorescent violet. Every time a ground crew saw that purple color, they knew they were handling something absolutely special, something that represented the cutting edge of chemical engineering and aviation technology. They knew they were dealing with liquid power. So what exactly did this magical purple fuel mean when American pilots actually got it in the air? Let's talk about the numbers. because the numbers are what really tell the story. A standard P-51D Mustang running on regular high-grade fuel was already an incredibly impressive machine. On standard fuel, that Mustang could top out at around 437 miles per hour. That was insanely fast for 1944. That was faster than just about every other fighter plane in existence, except for a few specialized German jet prototypes that barely left the ground. 437 miles per hour. That's borderline unbeatable for the vast majority of situations. But take that exact same Mustang, fill it up with the purple grade 150 fuel, and things go absolutely berserk. The engine could now run at an unheard of 75 inches of manifold pressure. For the non-aviation folks watching this, manifold pressure is essentially a measure of how hard the supercharger is pushing air into the engine. The higher the manifold pressure, the more air is being forced into the cylinders, the more fuel is being injected to match that air, and the more power is being generated. 75 inches was an absolutely insane manifold pressure for a 1944-era fighter engine. It was pushing the machinery to its absolute limit, running it right on the edge of catastrophic failure. But the grade 150 fuel made it possible. The result was a staggering 1,720 horsepower, almost 1,000 more horsepower than what that same engine could produce on standard fuel. And what does 1,720 horsepower get you? It gets you speeds approaching 490 miles per hour. 490 miles per hour. This was an absolutely mind-blowing speed for a propeller-driven fighter aircraft. We're talking about an aircraft that could move fast enough to outrun basically everything in the sky. For an American pilot in a P-51 Mustang running on grade 150, the entire aerial battlefield had shifted fundamentally. You didn't have to be a brilliant tactician anymore. You didn't have to outmaneuver your opponent or exploit weaknesses in their aircraft design. You could just accelerate away from anything that came after you. You could climb at rates that seemed impossible. You could build up speed in a dive and leave enemy fighters in the dust. Compare that to what a German pilot was working with. A Messerschmitt Bf-109, which was an incredibly capable fighter in its own right, topped out at around 400 miles per hour on a good day. 400 versus 490. 90 miles per hour advantage for the Americans. That's not just a speed advantage. That's not just something that makes the Mustang a little bit better. That's an almost unbeatable tactical advantage. You see, at those kinds of speed differentials, the engagement is fundamentally unbalanced. A German pilot in a Bf-109 couldn't outrun a Mustang on grade 150. They couldn't outclimb it. In almost any scenario, they were at a severe disadvantage. The American pilot could choose when to engage, when to break off, when to dive, when to climb. The German pilot had to react. The German pilot was always playing defense. And here's where it gets even more interesting. This wasn't some new aircraft design that Germany could identify and prepare a counter-strategy for. This wasn't some revolutionary new tactic that military planners could study and adapt to. This was a chemical advantage. This was something that the Germans literally couldn't see coming, couldn't identify, and couldn't counter effectively. How do you fight an enemy that's flying on a fuel source you don't have access to? How do you develop defensive tactics against a performance advantage that seems to defy explanation? German pilots were watching Mustangs do things that shouldn't have been physically possible given their understood specifications. They were reporting incidents that their superiors dismissed as fantasy. So, let's talk about why Germany couldn't just go out and create their own grade 150 fuel. The answer to that question is really a fascinating look into the industrial and technological capabilities of the two combatants. Germany's approach to fuel production was fundamentally different from America's, and that difference would ultimately doom them. While Germany was painstakingly creating synthetic fuel from coal through a slow and incredibly inefficient process, we're talking about the Burgess process and Fischer-Tropsch synthesis, which are these labor-intensive chemical processes that take a ton of energy and a ton of time, American refineries were using advanced, cutting-edge techniques like catalytic cracking to churn out millions and millions and millions of gallons of incredibly high-octane gasoline. This wasn't even close to being a fair comparison. American oil refineries had access to enormous quantities of crude oil from California, from Texas, from Oklahoma, and from Venezuela. They could process this crude oil using sophisticated refining techniques that Germany simply didn't have access to. The catalytic cracking process, in particular, was revolutionary. It allowed American refineries to take heavy crude oil and break it down into lighter, higher-octane components at an industrial scale. Germany couldn't do this. Their synthetic fuel program was a marvel of engineering, sure, but it was fundamentally limited by the amount of coal available, the energy required to process it, and the sheer manpower involved in the entire operation. The advantage wasn't just a small one. This wasn't like the Americans had 10% more fuel production capacity. We're talking about a massive industrial-scale advantage. America was producing millions of gallons of high-octane aviation fuel per month, while Germany was struggling to produce enough synthetic fuel to keep their Luftwaffe flying. The Luftwaffe was literally fuel-starved by 1944, dealing with severe fuel rationing that limited pilot training, limited aircraft operations, and limited their ability to respond to American bombing campaigns. Meanwhile, American pilots were flying on some of the most advanced fuel in the world, with such an abundance that they could afford to fly missions knowing full well that some aircraft wouldn't make it home. By the way, if you're finding this deep dive into forgotten military technology absolutely captivating, if you're the kind of person who gets genuinely excited about learning how technological advantages shape the course of history, then I'm going to ask you one more time to hit that subscribe button. We're doing this kind of content every single week, and honestly, there's nothing else like it on the platform. We go deep on stories that most people have never even heard of. The secret weapons, the classified operations, the hidden decisions that changed everything. You're going to want to be here for all of it. So subscribe right now and never miss another upload. Ring that notification bell. Let's build this community together. Now, this incredible advantage that America had didn't come without a price tag. The grade 150 fuel was absolutely packed with tetraethyl lead, which is a toxic anti-knock agent that's incredibly powerful at preventing detonation, but also incredibly nasty stuff that requires extremely careful handling. Lead poisoning can be absolutely devastating to human health, causing neurological damage, organ failure, and a whole host of other serious medical problems. The ground crews who were handling this fuel had to take serious precautions. They had to wear protective equipment, work in well-ventilated areas, and avoid any kind of skin contact with the fuel. Even with all these precautions, there were still health risks associated with handling it regularly, but the negative effects weren't limited to ground crew safety. The tetraethyl lead also caused the engines themselves to wear out significantly faster. The lead deposits would build up on spark plugs, fouling them, reducing their effectiveness, and eventually making them useless. Cylinder heads would accumulate carbon and lead deposits, reducing their ability to dissipate heat and potentially causing hot spots that could lead to catastrophic engine failures. The pistons would get damaged by the lead deposits. The entire engine would be under extraordinary stress from running at those insane 75-inch manifold pressures, and the lead in the fuel was actually accelerating the wear and tear process. Ground crews working on American fighter aircraft had to work overtime, replacing spark plugs constantly, inspecting cylinders after every mission, cleaning out the accumulated deposits, and performing maintenance that never seemed to end. The amount of work required to keep these engines running at peak performance was absolutely staggering. But here's the thing, nobody complained. Not a single ground crew member, not a single maintenance officer, not a single pilot complained about the cost of running these engines hot and hard on grade 150 fuel. Because every extra mile per hour of speed that their pilots had was another opportunity for them to come home alive. Every extra knot of performance was another chance to outrun an enemy fighter, to outclimb a pursuing Bf-109, to deliver a devastating attack and get back to base in one piece. The human cost of war made the mechanical wear and tear on these engines completely irrelevant. A worn-out spark plug could be replaced. A damaged cylinder could be inspected and repaired. A destroyed engine could be swapped out for a new one. But a dead pilot couldn't be replaced. A shot-down Mustang meant one less fighter in the air, one less presence defending the bomber formations, one less pair of eyes watching for enemy fighters. So the decision to run these engines hot and hard on grade 150 fuel was an easy one for American commanders to make. The tactical advantage was too important to pass up, and the logistics of maintaining these aircraft, while difficult, were well within American industrial capacity. In May of 1944, the purple fuel began arriving in England in significant quantities. The American 8th Air Force had been testing grade 150 fuel in small quantities before this, and the results had been so impressive that they decided to start distributing it on a larger scale. When American pilots began using grade 150 fuel in their Mustangs, the impact was immediate, dramatic, and absolutely devastating to German air superiority. German pilots started reporting incidents that sounded like they'd been pulled straight out of a science fiction novel. Mustangs that could accelerate vertically, pulling up at angles that seemed to defy the structural limitations of the airframe, climbing at rates that left pursuing Bf-109s way down below. Mustangs that could outrun German fighters in a dive, accelerating away to speeds that seemed impossible. Mustangs that could close distances in the blink of an eye, closing from a safe distance to gun range almost instantaneously. Mustangs that could turn the tables on pursuing German fighters, reversing the tactical situation and putting the Germans on the defensive within seconds. The reports were consistent. They were detailed, and they were absolutely terrifying to the pilots who were experiencing these encounters. But when these reports made their way up the chain of command to Luftwaffe intelligence officers and high-ranking military commanders, they were dismissed almost immediately. The intelligence officers thought the pilots were cracking under the pressure, suffering from combat fatigue, or simply exaggerating their experiences to explain how they'd let American fighters escape from engagements. The Luftwaffe leadership couldn't believe that the laws of aerial combat had been fundamentally rewritten overnight. They couldn't accept the notion that the Americans had developed something that completely invalidated their understanding of fighter performance. So they dismissed the reports. They reassured their pilots that the Mustangs weren't doing anything fundamentally new, and they ordered the Luftwaffe to continue operations as usual. But the pilots knew better. They could feel it in their hands on the stick. They could see it in the performance differentials they were experiencing. They could read it in the terrified faces of their wingmen who'd watched American fighters do impossible things right in front of their eyes. Something had changed. Something fundamental had shifted in the balance of power. Interestingly, the grade 150 fuel became unexpectedly crucial in a completely different aerial battle that was happening at the same time over British airspace. Hitler had unleashed his V-1 buzz bombs, early cruise missiles that were the precursors to intercontinental ballistic missiles. These weren't sophisticated guided weapons. They were essentially pilotless aircraft packed with explosives, flying on a predetermined course at a fixed altitude and speed. They flew at approximately 400 miles per hour, which made them incredibly difficult to intercept with conventional fighter aircraft. Most fighters simply couldn't catch them, and the ones that could had very narrow margins. You had to get on their tail, build up speed in a dive, and hope you had enough performance to pull alongside them before they reached their target. But for a Mustang or a Hawker Tempest running on grade 150 fuel, these V-1s suddenly became catchable. They weren't just barely catchable, they were easy prey. American and British pilots could climb to altitude, spot an incoming V-1, dive down to build up speed, accelerate to the necessary velocity, and position themselves for a shot. The speed advantage that Grade 150 provided made the interception process straightforward instead of barely possible. And this mattered enormously to the people living in London and the surrounding areas who were being terrorized by these weapons. Allied pilots essentially became the last line of defense against the V-1s, plucking them out of the sky before they could reach their targets and devastate civilian populations. One of the most legendary German aces from the entire war, a pilot named Günther Röll, who had over 275 confirmed kills and was one of the most accomplished fighter pilots in the entire Luftwaffe, recalled being absolutely shocked and bewildered by the performance of American fighters late in the war. Röll was an incredibly skilled pilot who'd spent years mastering the art of aerial combat. But when he encountered Mustangs running on Grade 150 fuel, he simply couldn't understand how they had become so incredibly fast. He'd studied American fighter performance before deploying. He understood their known capabilities, and he knew their limitations. But the reality he was experiencing in the air didn't match his understanding of how these aircraft should perform. Röll, like every other German pilot flying at that time, didn't know the secret. He didn't know about the purple fuel. He didn't know that American chemists had created something revolutionary. He didn't know that physics and chemistry had combined to create a weapon that was functionally invisible but absolutely devastating. The performance advantage was real, it was tangible, and it was consistently giving American pilots a tactical advantage in almost every scenario. But the source of that advantage remained completely mysterious to the German command structure until very late in the war. The psychological effect that Grade 150 fuel had on the Luftwaffe was absolutely crippling. German pilots who'd started the war as confident, well-trained, and capable fighters were now regularly engaging in air combat against enemies that had a seemingly insurmountable performance advantage. They were already outnumbered. The sheer numerical advantage that America could bring to bear was overwhelming by 1944. American factories were producing fighters at a rate that Germany simply couldn't match. Pilot training programs were churning out experienced pilots with hundreds of flight hours, while German pilot training had been decimated by earlier losses and severe fuel shortages that limited training missions. But now, on top of being outnumbered, German pilots also had to face an enemy that seemed to have an unlimited performance advantage. Their traditional tactical options simply vanished. They couldn't run from an enemy fighter because the Mustangs could accelerate faster and reach higher speeds. They couldn't hide because the Mustangs could climb higher and faster. And they absolutely couldn't win in a direct engagement because the performance differential was simply too great. Every decision a German pilot made was constrained by the overwhelming advantages that Grade 150 fuel had given the American fighters. The numbers tell the story with perfect clarity. Before the new fuel arrived in England in May of 1944, American bomber losses were a genuinely painful 3 to 6% per mission. When you're flying massive bomber formations with hundreds of aircraft, a 3 to 6% loss rate means you're losing dozens of bombers per mission. You're losing experienced crews, you're losing expensive aircraft, and you're losing the momentum of your bombing campaign as you have to stop and rebuild your bomber formations. After the Grade 150 fuel arrived and was distributed to American fighter squadrons, those losses dropped dramatically to under 2% per mission. Think about what that means. That's a reduction in losses of as much as 2/3. That's a massive, measurable, quantifiable improvement in bomber survival rates. That's American pilots getting their bombers through to their targets more effectively, surviving longer, and returning home to fly another mission. The Grade 150 fuel didn't just give Mustang pilots a psychological boost or a marginal performance advantage. It fundamentally changed the calculus of the air war over Europe. It made American bomber formations nearly impossible to break through. It made German defensive operations increasingly ineffective. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, who was the commander of the entire Luftwaffe and one of the most powerful figures in the Nazi regime, famously said that the moment he saw P-51 Mustangs over Berlin, he knew the war was lost. Göring was politically astute enough to understand what that presence meant. American fighters over Berlin meant the Americans had the range to escort bombers all the way to the heart of Germany. It meant German air defenses couldn't keep American bombers out anymore. It meant the sky above Germany was no longer exclusively German territory. Göring's statement is one of the most powerful assessments of the air war's turning point that we have from someone in a position of authority. But here's the kicker. Göring never knew the half of it. He never knew about the purple fuel. He never understood that the Mustangs he was looking at in Berlin's skies weren't just flying on superior engineering and brilliant aircraft design. They were flying on a chemical miracle. They were running on fuel that had been specifically engineered to be more powerful, more capable, and more revolutionary than anything Germany could hope to produce. Göring knew the war was lost when he saw those Mustangs, but he didn't understand that the true secret weapon wasn't the aircraft itself. It was what was flowing through the aircraft's fuel system. The grade. 150 fuel became increasingly important to American air operations throughout the remainder of 1944 and into 1945 as German aircraft production continued to decline and fuel shortages became increasingly severe. German pilots found themselves flying older, worn-out aircraft on rationed fuel supplies, while American pilots were flying the latest variants of the Mustang on unlimited supplies of the world's most advanced aviation fuel. The disparity grew wider and wider as the months passed. By early 1945, the air war was essentially over. German fighters could still get airborne, they could still engage American formations, but they couldn't win. They couldn't even effectively defend their own territory anymore. The final months of the air war in Europe were essentially a cleanup operation. American fighters had overwhelming air superiority, superior speed, superior climb rates, superior firepower, and superior numbers. German pilots who survived to see the end of the war talked about the late war period as an exercise in futility. You went up knowing you probably wouldn't make it back. You went up knowing you were going to be chased by faster, better-equipped fighters. You went up because it was your duty, because your superiors ordered you to, but not because you believed there was any way to turn the tide. The war in the air was lost, and everyone who was flying at that time knew it. Now, let me tell you something about what made Grade 150 fuel so special from a purely chemical perspective. Because this is actually fascinating stuff that shows just how much thinking went into this fuel. The high octane rating was achieved through a combination of refining techniques and chemical additives. American refiners were using processes like alkylation, which combines smaller hydrocarbon molecules into larger, higher octane molecules. They were using catalytic cracking to break down heavy crude oil fractions into lighter, more useful components. And they were blending in specially formulated aromatic hydrocarbons that had incredibly high octane numbers. The tetraethyl lead that I mentioned earlier was the anti-knock agent that made the high-pressure operation possible. But American chemists were also working on other additives and compounds that could help protect the engine and maintain performance. They were adding de-icing additives to prevent ice crystal formation in fuel lines at high altitudes. They were adding metal deactivators to prevent certain metals from catalyzing gum formation. They were adding antioxidants to prevent the fuel from degrading over time. Every component of Grade 150 fuel was carefully considered, rigorously tested, and optimized for maximum performance. The production of Grade 150 fuel wasn't trivial either. American refineries had to maintain strict quality control standards. The octane rating had to be consistent. The additives had to be blended in exactly the right proportions. The fuel had to meet military specifications that were far more demanding than civilian aviation fuel standards. When a pilot loaded purple fuel into their Mustang, they knew exactly what they were getting. They knew the fuel would perform as advertised. They knew the engine would respond predictably. That consistency and reliability was almost as important as the raw performance advantage that Grade 150 provided. In contrast, German synthetic fuel production was inconsistent. The quality varied depending on how well the Fischer-Tropsch plants were operating, depending on the quality of the coal being used, depending on 100 different variables that were hard to control at an industrial scale. German pilots often didn't know exactly what kind of fuel they were getting. Sometimes their aircraft performed well, sometimes they didn't. That inconsistency was yet another disadvantage that compounded the performance gap between German and American fighters. The story of Grade 150. Fuel is ultimately a story about the intersection of science, technology, industry, and warfare. It's a story about how a relatively small group of scientists and chemical engineers working in laboratories and refineries achieved something that fundamentally altered the course of military history. It's a story about how industrial capacity, access to natural resources, and technological innovation can combine to create advantages that seem almost insurmountable to an opponent who lacks those same resources and technological capabilities. In the end, the air war over Europe wasn't won purely by brave pilots, though courage was certainly essential. It wasn't won purely by brilliant aircraft designers, though the P-51 Mustang was an incredibly well-designed machine. The air war was won in laboratories and refineries by chemists and engineers who figured out how to squeeze out that extra bit of performance, that extra bit of power, that extra bit of speed that gave American pilots an advantage they could exploit again and again. The Purple Death was more than just gasoline. It was more than just an aviation fuel. It was a symbol of the overwhelming industrial and technological might that America possessed, and Germany simply could not counter or overcome. It was a weapon that the German high command never saw coming, a threat they couldn't identify, and an advantage they couldn't neutralize. It was a decisive factor in the air war, one that helped turn the tide of the entire European campaign, and one that contributed significantly to Allied victory in World War II. The legacy of Grade 150 fuel extends beyond the immediate tactical advantage it provided to American pilots. It demonstrated the importance of chemical engineering and advanced fuel technology to military aviation. After the war, all the major air forces in the world recognized the importance of advanced aviation fuels and made significant investments in fuel research and development. The lessons learned from Grade 150 fuel influenced the development of jet fuel for the early supersonic fighters of the 1950s, the refining techniques that American companies had pioneered during the war continued to be used and improved upon in the decades that followed. But more than that, the story of Grade 150 fuel is a powerful reminder of something that gets overlooked in a lot of popular military history. We talk about the tank battles, we talk about the epic aerial dogfights, we celebrate the individual heroism of pilots and soldiers. Those things matter, absolutely. But the truth is that wars are won and lost in laboratories just as much as they're won and lost on battlefields. The scientists, the engineers, the chemists working behind the scenes, making incremental improvements, pushing the boundaries of what's possible. These people are just as important to military success as the combat pilots. Think about it. Günter Rall was one of the greatest fighter pilots of all time. The guy had over 275 kills. He was incredibly skilled, incredibly experienced, and incredibly dangerous. But none of that mattered when he was facing a Mustang running on Grade 150 fuel, because the fuel had nullified all of his tactical advantages. His superior skills in a dogfight didn't matter when the Mustang could just accelerate away. His experience didn't matter when the American pilot had a speed advantage of nearly 100 miles per hour. The technological advantage had overcome the human skill advantage. That's the story of the air war in a nutshell. That's how technology and chemistry can completely reshape a battlefield. This is also a fascinating example of how access to natural resources directly translates into military power. America had access to enormous quantities of crude oil from Texas, California, Oklahoma, and Venezuela. Germany had coal, but coal-based synthetic fuel production was slow, inefficient, and incredibly energy-intensive. America could produce millions of gallons of high-octane fuel per month. Germany struggled to produce enough fuel to keep their fighters flying. That resource advantage, multiplied across the entire war, was absolutely devastating to German military capabilities. It's a reminder that warfare in the modern era isn't just about clever tactics or brilliant strategies. It's about who has more stuff, who can produce more stuff, and who can innovate faster to make their stuff better. The Grade 150 fuel story also illustrates an important principle about technological advantages in warfare. When one side develops a significant technological advantage, the other side has basically three options. First, they can try to capture or steal the technology from the enemy. Germany never figured out the secret of the purple fuel. And even if they had, they didn't have the refining capacity or the access to resources needed to produce it. Second, they can develop their own counter-technology. Germany couldn't do this either because their fuel research programs were stuck in the coal-to-fuel conversion mindset. They couldn't pivot quickly enough to develop their own high-octane fuel production capability. Third, they can adapt their tactics and strategy to work around the disadvantage. German pilots tried this approach. They started focusing on ground attack missions, on protecting their territory by flying at lower altitudes, on working in smaller groups to avoid the overwhelming numbers of American fighters. But by then, it was too late. The advantage was too great, and German resources were too depleted to implement any of these strategies. Effectively, there's also an interesting ethical dimension to the Grade 150 fuel story that doesn't get discussed very often. The tetraethyl lead that made this fuel so powerful was incredibly toxic. Ground crews working with this fuel on a daily basis were being exposed to lead poisoning, which can cause neurological damage, psychological disorders, and long-term health problems. Some of the people who maintained these aircraft developed health problems later in life that were directly linked to their exposure to leaded aviation fuel. That's a real human cost that's sometimes overlooked when we celebrate the technological achievement. After the war, tetraethyl lead became the standard anti-knock additive in commercial aviation fuel for decades, and eventually it was used in automobile gasoline as well. The health consequences of widespread lead exposure from leaded gasoline had enormous public health implications. It took decades and a massive public health campaign to finally eliminate lead from commercial gasoline in most countries around the world. So in a sense, the Grade 150 fuel story is not just a story about military technology and wartime innovation. It's also a story about the unintended consequences of technological advancement and the importance of considering health and environmental factors when developing new technologies. Let me also talk about the specific pilots who flew with this fuel and what their experiences were like. The American 8th Air Force pilots who got to use Grade 150 fuel knew they had something special. They could feel it the moment they pushed the throttle forward, and the engine responded with an absolutely ferocious surge of power. They could feel it in the acceleration, in the climb rate, in the ability to outmaneuver opponents who'd been giving them trouble before. Pilots started to develop a kind of swagger, a confidence that came from knowing they had a machine that was fundamentally superior to anything their enemies could put in the air. One pilot, whose name I can't recall exactly, kept a journal during the war and wrote about the first time he flew a Mustang on Grade 150 fuel. He said something like, "I pulled the stick back, and the nose went up so fast, I thought something was broken. I've never felt an acceleration like that in my entire life. For a moment, I thought maybe my engine was about to explode from the power output, but it just kept climbing and climbing and climbing. By the time I leveled off, I was at 30,000 feet, and there were no enemy fighters anywhere near me. I could have climbed higher if I wanted to." That's the kind of experience that pilots were having when they transitioned to Grade 150 fuel. It wasn't just a marginal improvement. It was a revelation. It was a complete transformation of what was possible in the air. Another interesting aspect of this story is how the information about grade 150th fuel was handled from a security perspective. This was classified information. The Allies didn't want the Germans to find out what they were doing. They didn't want the Germans to understand the technological basis for the performance advantage they were seeing. So the purple dye served a dual purpose. On one hand, it allowed ground crews to visually identify the fuel so they could maintain proper handling procedures. On the other hand, it was a kind of security feature. If a downed Mustang was recovered by German forces, the presence of purple fuel residue in the tanks would be an obvious indicator that something unusual was going on. But by the time Germany had captured enough Mustangs with purple fuel residue to realize what was happening, it was too late to do anything about it. The technology was secure enough that German scientists couldn't reverse engineer it quickly enough to make a difference. The American High Command kept grade 150 fuel as a closely guarded secret throughout the war. Very few people knew about it. Even many of the pilots flying with it didn't know the specific technical details of why the fuel was so powerful. They just knew it worked, and they loved it. Some pilots were told it was a new blend of regular fuel. Some were told it was experimental fuel that they shouldn't talk about. Some pilots actually didn't know they were flying on grade 150 fuel at all. They just knew their Mustangs were performing incredibly well and assumed it was some new manufacturing process or a slight adjustment to their engines. The secrecy around grade 150 fuel was so complete that the Germans never really figured it out. After the war, when German military officers and aircraft engineers were being interrogated by Allied intelligence, many of them expressed absolute astonishment when they learned that the performance advantage they'd been experiencing was due to fuel chemistry. They'd been expecting some kind of structural modification to the airframes, some kind of engine redesign, some kind of revolutionary new technology. The idea that the secret was in the fuel, that such a significant advantage could come from something as simple as a more advanced aviation fuel, had simply never occurred to them. This speaks to how compartmentalized military technology development was during World War II. Germany had their own fuel research programs, their own aircraft designers, their own engine manufacturers. But because the entire German military-industrial complex was under the control of the Nazi regime and organized according to the Führer principle, with different departments competing with each other for resources and influence, information didn't always flow between departments as effectively as it could have. A breakthrough in fuel chemistry might happen in one laboratory, while aircraft designers in another facility were working on completely different approaches to improving performance. There was less of a holistic, integrated approach to technological development in the German military-industrial complex compared to what was happening in America. In America, the military services, the government, the private sector, and the scientific community were all working together in an unprecedented level of cooperation. The Manhattan Project is the most famous example of this coordinated effort, but it happened across the entire spectrum of military technology development. When American scientists made a breakthrough in fuel chemistry, that information could be quickly shared with aircraft manufacturers, with military operators, and with logistics personnel who could figure out how to produce and distribute the fuel at scale. This integrated approach to technological development gave America a significant advantage in the ability to turn scientific discoveries into practical military advantages. Let me talk for a moment about what happened to aviation fuel technology after the war. The advancements that had been made during the war didn't just disappear. They became the foundation for aviation fuel technology during the Cold War and beyond. The jet age was just beginning in 1945, and the early jet aircraft needed fuel formulations that were completely different from the piston engine fuel like grade 150. But the refining techniques that American companies had developed to produce high-octane gasoline were adapted and modified to produce jet fuel. The understanding of anti-knock additives and fuel chemistry that had been developed during the war informed the development of military jet fuel specifications. By the 1950s, American jet fighters were flying on fuels that were even more sophisticated than Grade 150. The F-86 Sabre, the F-84 Thunderjet, the F-100 Super Sabre. These aircraft were all running on fuels that incorporated decades of research and development. And interestingly, some of this fuel technology made its way into the commercial aviation industry. Commercial jet airliners like the Boeing 707 and the Douglas DC-8 were flying on fuel formulations that had military origins but had been adapted for civilian use. The legacy of Grade 150. Fuel in aviation history is profound. It's not just that the fuel was powerful and revolutionary for its time. It's that the fuel represented a new approach to military-industrial development. It represented the idea that sometimes the most important advantages in warfare come not from flashy, visible technologies, but from less obvious innovations in supporting technologies and materials. A Mustang without Grade 150 fuel was a very good fighter aircraft. A Mustang with Grade 150 fuel was an absolutely dominant fighter aircraft. The difference was night and day, and that difference came from something that most people wouldn't even think to look at: the fuel. This is an important lesson for understanding military history and understanding how wars are actually won. We tend to focus on the headline technologies, the tanks, the battleships, the aircraft, the weapons, but the supporting technologies, the fuel, the ammunition, the spare parts, the maintenance systems, those are just as important, sometimes more important, to military success. An army with the best tanks in the world, but a broken supply chain, will lose to an army with slightly inferior tanks, but a functioning logistical system. A fighter aircraft with an incredibly powerful engine but unreliable fuel will lose to an aircraft with a slightly less powerful engine but access to superior fuel. Character to Hooters. 150 Fuel story is ultimately a story about the intersection of chemistry, engineering, industrial capacity, and military strategy. It's a story about how a group of scientists and engineers working in American refineries and laboratories figured out how to create something that gave American pilots an almost unbeatable advantage. It's a story about how that advantage was used to turn the tide of the air war in Europe. It's a story about how technological innovation, when combined with industrial capacity, can be absolutely decisive in warfare. And it's a story about how, sometimes, the most important weapons are the ones that nobody even knows about until the war is over, and the historians start digging into the details. The German pilots who faced American Mustangs running on Grade 150. Fuel came home with stories that seemed like fantasy. They talked about Mustangs that could accelerate vertically. They talked about Mustangs that could outrun them in a dive by enormous margins. They talked about Mustangs that seemed to have performance characteristics that were impossible according to everything they understood about aircraft design and engine performance. And for decades after the war, many of these pilots didn't know that the secret behind these impossible performances was hidden in the fuel tank. It wasn't until they read about it in books, or heard it from other pilots, or attended aircraft museum events, that they finally understood what they'd been facing. There's something almost poetic about that, in a way. A weapon so perfect, so elegant, so complete in its design that it was invisible to the enemy until it was too late. The Germans developed radar, which was an incredibly sophisticated piece of technology for the time. The Allies developed Grade 150 fuel, which was an incredibly sophisticated piece of chemistry for the time. Radar allowed you to see your enemy from a distance. Grade 150 fuel made your aircraft so fast and so powerful that your enemy couldn't catch you, even if they could see you. Both were revolutionary technologies, but one was immediately obvious, and the other remained mysterious until well after the war was over. Now here's where I want to bring this home for you, because this story isn't just about World War II history, and it's not just about fascinating technology. This story is about the importance of understanding how the world actually works. It's about understanding that sometimes the most important things are the ones that are least visible. It's about understanding that technological advantages aren't always about dramatic, headline-grabbing innovations. Sometimes they're about incremental improvements, about paying attention to the details, about figuring out how to squeeze out that extra bit of performance from a system that everyone else thinks they understand completely. That applies to almost everything, not just military technology. In business, it's the companies that are constantly trying to improve their supply chains, their manufacturing processes, their product quality by small increments that end up dominating their industries. In sports, it's the teams that obsess over marginal gains, slightly better conditioning, slightly better nutrition, slightly better training techniques that end up winning championships. In science, it's the researchers who are willing to dig deeper, to question their assumptions, to try things that other people haven't tried, that make the breakthrough discoveries that change the world. The Grade 1 to 50 fuel story teaches us that sometimes the difference between victory and defeat, between dominance and mediocrity, can come from something as apparently minor as fuel chemistry. It teaches us that you should never assume you understand a system completely. It teaches us that innovation can happen anywhere, in places and in ways that you might not expect. And it teaches us that sometimes the most powerful weapons are the ones that are hidden in plain sight, working behind the scenes, enabling everything else to function at peak performance. If you've watched this far, I want to say thank you. Thank you for sticking with me through this deep dive into one of the most fascinating and overlooked stories in military history. This is exactly the kind of content that we're passionate about creating here on this channel. Every week, we're diving into stories like this. Stories about forgotten technologies, about the unsung heroes who made possible the great events of history, about the hidden decisions and innovations that changed the world. These are stories that don't make it into the mainstream history books, but they deserve to be known and understood. If you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button right now. I'm asking you seriously because we depend on our subscribers to keep creating this content. YouTube's algorithm is notoriously difficult to work with for educational channels like ours, and we rely on our community to help spread the word. When you subscribe, you're not just getting access to more videos like this one. You're supporting the production of this content. You're telling YouTube that this is the kind of material people want to see. And you're helping us grow a community of people who care about military history, about forgotten technology, about understanding the true stories that shaped our world. Turn on those notification bells too, because we upload new videos regularly, and we want you to know the moment we go live with fresh content. Drop a like on this video, because that helps more people discover this story. And most importantly, tell your friends about this channel. Send this video to someone you know who's interested in history, who's interested in engineering, who's interested in how the world actually works. Share it with people who would find this fascinating because that's how our community grows, and that's how we can keep making videos like this. In the comments below, I'd love to hear from you. What do you think is the most underrated, most overlooked secret weapon of World War II? There are so many incredible stories. The code-breaking work at Bletchley Park, the innovations in radar technology, the development of new ship designs, the improvements in tank armor and firepower. There are so many stories that don't get nearly enough attention. Let me know in the comments what you think deserves more recognition, and let's talk about these incredible stories together. That's what our community is all about. Sharing knowledge, discussing history, and celebrating the incredible ingenuity of humans throughout history. Thank you again for watching, for subscribing, for being part of this community. This channel wouldn't exist without viewers like you who are hungry for authentic, well-researched, deeply informative content about military history and forgotten technology. Your support means everything to us, and we promise to keep bringing you stories that will blow your mind and expand your understanding of how the world works and how our history was shaped by the innovations and decisions of brilliant people working behind the scenes. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep seeking out the stories that the mainstream media overlooks. That's where the really fascinating stuff is hiding. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.